We're on. Very good. So welcome everyone. So I just want to give a brief introduction because we're going to talk about where we stand in terms of progress in the buildings and construction sector, what happened last year specifically in 2022. As you know, since we established the global ABC, tracking progress is one of our key actions, and it's also our flagship report, the Global Status Report on Buildings and Construction. We have produced 7 reports already to date, and we are constantly continuing to improve the content and the way we are analyzing the progress in the sector. And there I want to specifically thank, of course, the Building Performance Institute Europe, the University College of London with here in Hamilton, and the International Energy Agency, because they are the 3 organizations that have been really engaged in this effort since the beginning. And I believe that now there is absolutely sufficient evidence that the building and construction sector is a key sector for decarbonization. And that's, I think now there's more evidence than what we had before. I mean, everybody knew already it was an important sector, but I think with all the work that we've been doing, we've been getting this message out more strongly. But, I mean, the last building GSR was pretty clear that, unfortunately, despite knowing that this is an important sector, there's not that much progress in terms of decarbonization. I mean, last year we said basically we are not on track to achieve our target of the 1.5 degree, and that the actual gap, between the performance of the sector and the decarbonization pathway is widening. And I think Oliver will actually mention more about what he has seen over the last year, but in the previous report, okay, there was some progress because we see some progress in terms of the NDCs. More and more countries include building and construction in their NDCs. There is some progress on building energy efficiency. There's some kind of progress also with like building energy codes, but are these building energy codes actually really aligned with net zero? I think we're still far away from that. So there's still quite a bit of effort that is needed if we want to see the transformation that we need. And last year also we looked specifically at the African region, and as you know, the African region needs a lot of construction still. And when we talk about construction, well, it's materials. And I think the whole part of the embodied carbon, which was one of the focus also last year where we looked at materials and embodied carbon, is a very critical part to start looking at when we talk about decarbonization. There's been a lot of focus on operational energy for many years. I think there's more and more interest now also to look at this embodied carbon, and people are starting to say, like, this is a very critical, important issue, but still a difficult one to tackle. But when we think about a continent like Africa, it's not the places where actually the operational energy of the buildings is high. It's actually much more, and especially if we think about the construction that is coming, it's actually going to be way more on the embodied carbon part. Even when you go to India, most of the buildings actually, operationally, it's not that much energy. It's all about the operational carbon. So it's really important to start tackling this specific, topic of embodied carbon in the sector. So this year, we are unfortunately not launching our building GSR at COP, which we've been doing all the previous years, but we still wanted to make sure that we can show where we stand in terms of progress of the sector, and that's for this reason I'm inviting Oliver Rapf to give us a preview of what's going to come in the next report, and the report will be launched at the Building and Climate Global Forum that UNEP is organizing with the government of France, and which will take place on 7-8 March in Paris, and where we hope to see as many people from the community to continue pushing for the buildings and construction sector. Oliver, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for the introduction. And welcome everybody to this session in which I would like to try answering the question, how far the construction sector has come, the buildings and construction sector has come on the decarbonization journey, and how much progress there is or how many delays there have been. Now this is a joint exercise of a team led by Professor Ian Hamilton of University College London and my team in BPIE, but we also benefit tremendously from the collaboration with the IEA, which is providing us with many of the data I'm going to share with you. So, this is a preview of the title slide of the 2023 Global Status Report, but as Jonathan said, we're not launching it today. It will be a 2023/2024 report, which will be launched in March 2024. And it is really this collaborative effort, and I will give you an update on the CO2 emissions we are seeing in the sector. We look at the drivers for a potential decrease or a potential increase. We are updating our policy sections, our sections on finance, on investments, on key actions, which we see on NDC. So it's truly a very comprehensive global report, whether the sector is on track to meet the commitments which have been signed up to in the Paris Agreement. So, this is a copy of the global stocktake. And as all the stocktake exercises, whether they are sectoral, whether they are regional, whether they are global, have found, we're unfortunately not on track. And this is also the fact for the buildings and construction sector. And I want to describe and summarize why this is the case, and also what we could do to get back on track. In order to provide a very simple answer to this very complex question, whether we are on track or not, we've developed a tool which is called the Global Buildings Climate Tracker. This is an index. It doesn't have a unit. It's not about percent or gigatons or kilowatt hours or terawatt hours, whatever. It is really a combination of indicators, and I will explain them in a moment. But that combination basically tells us whether we are on track or not. And the idea is, once the sector is fully on track in 2050, it will have achieved what we call decarbonisation points, 100 decarbonisation points. That's the goal to be at in 2050. The curve to follow is this one. It's actually aligned with the IEA's net zero emissions scenario. And where the sector is at the moment is described by this dark blue line down here. And you see, we've been following this, we've been measuring it since 2015. And you see the line is, going up and down around the zero line, but it's definitely not aligned with the decarbonisation pathway, the steeper curve where we should be. And in fact, if we look at the trend of the line since 2015, we're seeing, unfortunately, a stagnation of progress. That's sobering. We see a little bit of a highlight here in 2020, interestingly enough, but that has to do with the global COVID pandemic, with a global slowdown of economic activities, office buildings, warehouses have been used much less, and so on and so forth. So that's the COVID effect. In total, we see a stagnation. So, what is behind this one statement, this one figure? The index is composed of a number of indicators describing action the private sector and governments can take. It has two indicators which are describing the potential impact. And all this is taken into account with the CO2 emissions, which are also measured and observed. And that comes to that total index figure. Now, going through these individual indicators, and I want to start with one of the impact indicators, will give us a more detailed story. So this is the progress we see or we do not see when it comes to the energy intensity, and that's measured in kilowatt hours per square meter and year. Again, the light blue should be the path to the goal. The dark blue is the observed energy intensity over time. And you see the light blue path is lower than the observed. There is a gap of 18.8 kilowatt hours per square meter. That is a global average figure, of course. That is different from region to region. But what we observe over the years that the size of the gap has increased by 50% on average year by year. So yes, we're making some small improvements in the energy intensity, but it's just not big enough to be on track. Now, if we look at the global energy demand from buildings and construction, you see the figures lined up here in this bar graph since 2010, and we're observing this increase over time. And on the pie chart, you see how it's split up. About 21% of the final energy consumption comes from residential buildings, 9% from non-residential buildings, and about 4% is caused by the buildings construction industry itself. So this is the energy consumption aligned with that indicator which I've shown you earlier. Moving to the renewable energy share, because, well, efficiency is one of the solutions. We also want to increase the share of renewable energies in buildings. We see that since 2015, since we follow that, the renewable energy share has increased by about 1 percentage point only. Ideally, to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, we would be at over 11%. But we're only close to 6%. So again, a significant gap here, and this gap has increased by about 36% on average every year. And of course that means that if we had clear and ambitious plans for the phase-out of fossil fuels in buildings, the situation would be very, very different. And if we would implement the solutions which are there, we would be able to see a significant growth towards the decarbonisation pathway, but we do not see that because we essentially do not have the policies and programs in place globally at the moment. Now, looking at another indicator we're using, the green certification of buildings. For that indicator, we evaluate programs from around the world. We use the programs for the analysis which share their certification data annually, or where we have come to a friendly agreement that they give us the data. So this does not cover all of the certification schemes around the world, but it definitely covers the larger ones. And it's really a geographical spread all around the world. This is not only Europe or not only North America. It also includes certification schemes, for example, of the Arab region here. So what we are trying to define is how much is the cumulated amount of green energy certification. And there we've also defined a path, but also we're seeing, though there is a significant growth over the years, the dark blue line, the gap to be aligned with the Paris Agreement is still there. But for example, compared to the other indicators I've shown you, we see a steeper growth here, and we are much more aligned with the ideal pathway. Another very important indicator which we're tracking relates to the NDCs. And the question whether the countries who report the NDCs to the UNFCCC framework really integrate buildings in their national strategies, in their national commitments, and do that to a large degree, to a really, with an in-depth detail, not only saying, well, buildings efficiency or renewable energy in buildings is important, but really asking the question, do these NDCs have a detailed commitment, a detailed strategy on buildings? And what we find is that in 2022, only 17 countries have this detail about how to decarbonize the buildings and construction sector. If we simply count the NDCs, which mention buildings, we actually come to this dotted line here, well above the pathway. But simply mentioning and saying, well, buildings are important, we have to do something about mitigation in the building sector is not sufficient. We would ideally like to see detail. And because we do not have enough detail, we again see this gap here, which is quite significant. And we think that's a pity, because we would expect at least the G20 members to have a detailed NDC on buildings. And we also think that all the rest of the countries should, by 2030, ideally have more detail on buildings in their NDCs. If we look at the progress by countries, you actually see which countries do not mention buildings at all. These are the red countries. You see countries which have a focus on adaptation, which are the yellow countries on the map here, mainly in Africa. But you also see that many countries actually mention energy efficiency in some detail, but not in a very large detail as such. So the global picture is very mixed. And again, just to remind ourselves, it's only 17 countries which have some detail there. Looking at a key policy, building codes, and asking the question, are building codes aligned with the idea to have zero-emission buildings, to really have a Paris-aligned buildings and construction sector in place? We see, on the positive end, a bit of an increase since 2020, but far, far away from where we ideally should be. Essentially, we find that in 2022, we had exactly 3 countries where we think that the National Building Energy Code is aligned with the idea to have zero-emission buildings. And this gap between where we are and where we should be really has grown by almost 40% since we collect this data. And that is, of course, a real dilemma. It's a real dilemma for the regions, for the countries where we have an enormous growth of new buildings, because all these buildings built today are not built to a code which would specify a zero-emission requirement. And that, of course, leaves a carbon legacy. But if we look at the fact, well, which countries actually do have a building code, even if it's not aligned with zero emissions, we see a bit of a better picture. You see that the dark blue is a mandatory code. The lighter blue is where codes at least have defined a performance standard. And all the countries which are encircled with a red line, which are sometimes rather small in Europe, but you also see a lot in Southeast Asia, in Australia, New Zealand, have codes which have been developed since 2020, which is a very positive development, because we see a lot of development on new building codes. And while they may not be really zero emissions building codes, they are nevertheless oriented towards the future, towards decreasing emissions, to increase energy efficiency, to increase the share of renewables in buildings. So that's actually quite a positive development to give you a true perspective. But if you look at Africa, where the color coding for no code is this brown-orange, you see quite a lot of countries which do not have a code at all. You also see it partially in Asia. And of course, these are regions, these are countries where we see an enormous growth of new buildings. So that's a real dilemma. That's really where I think we should ideally see some policy progress in the future. Another indicator which we're looking at is the question, well, how much money is really invested into energy efficiency? And that again is an indicator which adds up, which accumulates investments over time. So we want the amount to become bigger and bigger and bigger, of course, every year. And again, we see a significant growth with the dark blue line of the investment. But again, it's not sufficient to be in line with what we have defined as the Paris-aligned pathway. So the gap is still around 39% less investment in energy efficiency than we should ideally have. And this is in particular a problem for countries which have a well-established building stock, where the challenge is renovation rather than introducing zero-emission building codes for new builds. So this is in particular a challenge for North America, for the OECD countries, for Europe, for Australia, and so on, where the renovation challenge is much bigger than making sure that new buildings are aligned with the zero-emission pathway. And that's why we need to have solutions like the European policy of the renovation wave, the adoption of new, more stringent performance standards in North America, and so on and so forth. Again, looking at the efficiency investments in absolute terms, I already mentioned it's going up, but the big investments, the dark green bar, is actually happening in Europe. And yes, Europe has a large building stock, about 26, 27 billion square meters, but it's definitely not the largest region on this planet in terms of the existing building stock. The United States, light green, has a much lower amount of investments in efficiency. China has a significant part, and then the rest of the world is gray. The values for 2023 are estimated. We don't have the final figures yet. But again, as I said, there is a shortage of investment in that space. And all that means that the impact on emissions is not where it should be. The dark blue line shows us the emissions since 2015. And it's in line with my statement at the beginning. We're seeing a stagnation. And in fact, since last year, we see a 1% increase. Again, you see a little dip here in 2020 when COVID hit us. But since then, it's been going in the wrong direction. We're not on this Paris-aligned pathway. Ideally, emissions today would be at 7 gigatons of CO2, but the gap is 2.8. And so, in fact, significantly higher, 40% higher today than where we ideally should be. And again, if we're looking at the change over the years, this gap has increased by over 40% year by year, which is the big dilemma. So, this is then the share in the sector. You see the direct emissions for residential, the indirect emissions for residential, the smaller share for non-residential buildings, direct and indirect. But you also see the emissions coming directly from the construction industry. They are between 7 and 9. This is quite a wide range, but we do not have a global mechanism, a global data collection exercise, which really is collecting the data in a totally reliable way from construction. That's why we work here with a range, but we're quite certain also in close discussion with the IEA that this range is correct. But it is still a range, and that is a bit of a data uncertainty. But all in all, we see that the global buildings and construction sector has a significant share of global emissions. And that's why it needs to be addressed very, very urgently. So, what does this all mean? What can we do really to change that situation? Well, we think that first of all, governments need to collaborate much, much more to really define common metrics, to define common data collection exercises, to make sure that we have an international mechanism to monitor the situation much, much better than we do today. But then, of course, governments can really play an enormously important role in changing their procurement policies. If we had government procurement policies, which would only procure green, climate-friendly buildings, we would be in a very different situation than where we are today. The funding going into net zero buildings is also not sufficient in most countries. There might be some exceptions, but in principle, the funding is not sufficient. And we know that buildings and construction is something which is very regional, very local. What we need to instigate more, what we need to achieve more is collaboration, exchange of best practice, exchange of curriculum, exchange of knowledge globally. The North can learn from the South, the South can learn from the North, East and West, and so on. This is not a one-way street. There are excellent examples all over this planet of green, climate-friendly buildings. We need to come to a stronger collaboration on that point, and that is where governments, but also industry, can play a much, much bigger role. And I think that's also one of the goals which we want to achieve with the Global Buildings and Climate Forum happening then in March. And with that, I would like to close my sneak preview of that report being published in the beginning of March. And if there are any questions in the room, I'd be happy to take them now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. I mean, definitely we see, again, lack of progress. So, I mean, you mentioned, of course, the forum. I think most of you know also that on Wednesday we're launching the Buildings Breakthrough in France with Morocco. I think that's also a very important element to put forward because we're talking about the collaboration between countries. So the forum is the next step. But, you know, this is the first movement already, I would say, of a number of countries that actually show that they want to collaborate and take this forward, and a number of initiatives that are going to support this movement. So, definitely, international collaboration is needed, specifically in this sector. It's a complicated sector to address for all countries, so they can definitely learn from each other. I mean, I just know a few things, but I mean, we're seeing progress in certifications. For example, we're seeing some progress in some areas. I always think about buildings is like we all live in buildings, and you know, the majority of buildings are residential buildings. And I think the majority of certifications are not on residential buildings, for example. And the majority of the work that is happening towards net zero is not that much on residential buildings. And I'm thinking that if we really want to change the things, we actually really need to work on residential. If we manage to change the shift, you know, make the shift, I would say, in the residential sector, we've done it. And I think as long as it stays much on a number of, you know, more lighthouse projects, which is what happens most of the time. There are very few projects on housing that have been labeled net zero or have like very good performance. So I really think that's also where we need to collectively think on how, and this is also what supports us as human beings. I mean, we all, like, you know, the housing is a real issue in a number of countries, and I think housing is also what speaks to a number of the countries from the global south specifically, where a lot of housing issues are there in terms of, you know, a lot of people don't have like adequate housing overall. So I think bringing those two agendas together is also really important when we talk about this topic. I mean, open of course for any questions, reactions. So Yves Laurent, please, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Jean-Baptiste from France, and I have a question about the national code. And maybe, sorry, I will focus on Europe, but Europe is getting with EPBD a framework to deploy a national code aligned on Paris Agreement. But today, it's quite difficult to have a good understanding and global view of application of national code in every country. For us, we are working in France. We have some text and some laws which are very strong to apply the EPBD, but it's quite difficult to understand what is done in other countries in Europe. And for me, it's quite interesting to understand how do you consider the national code and how do you have a good understanding of what is applied.
Yeah. Well, the legislative situation actually, not only in Europe, but also in many other regions in North America, is complex, because the legislative power on building codes often lies with the national governments. It does in Europe. In the US and in Canada, it lies with the US states or with the Canadian provinces. So you have a patchwork of building codes. And as you say, often it's not easy to compare one with the other. what we have done as BPIE a few years ago is really to compare all the European building codes, asking the question whether they comply with the so-called nearly zero energy buildings standard, which is the standard of the EPBD as it's currently valid. But we also know right now Europe is negotiating a potential new standard, a zero emission building standard, literally these days, this week. Hopefully there is a conclusion on that. And yes, it's not easy to compare them, but it's also not absolutely necessary to compare them like with like, because it's always possible to measure whether they will lead to a climate neutral building stock by 2050. You can do this road mapping for each and every country, and I think that's important. Not so much comparing kilowatt hours and asking is the 1 kilowatt hour figure in one country higher than in the other country.
Thank you for sharing the great data. My name is Omar. I'm with Brainbox AI. I'm curious, you showed the gross emissions for the building sector. Have you looked at, I guess, emissions per square foot per year? And any comment on the relative value of that versus, because we see a lot of EUI, we see a lot of gross emissions. Any value, in your opinion, to circling specifically on the emissions per square foot?
No, we don't have that, simply because the data situation really does not allow that. That is really a dilemma. We do not have totally exact figures. How many square meters or square feet are built every year new? Right, that is a real dilemma. So we decided to not really express that. We have an idea about the energy consumption, but in the end, these are average values. But that detailed information, unfortunately, is not there. If we look at the global data situation, it's surprisingly patchy. I mean, the real estate industry is a global industry, active all over the world. But we do not have sufficient data on that. It's just not measured sufficiently. That's the reality. We hope that it will change. And I mean, one of the reasons why we do this exercise also is to not only track the evolution over time, but to really find where the data gaps are and where we need to find strategies and initiatives to fill those data gaps.
Yeah, two things. First thing is your recommendations are mainly going to governments, and my question is, how comes we don't have a very simple recommendation like stop financing gray buildings, brown buildings? I mean, how comes there's no recommendation for the whole financial sector that is still taking? I mean, the question is, certainly there is a question of increasing the finance, the green finance. The question is, how do we phase out the brown or the gray finance? How do we decide that finally there's no reason now that we know all that to take the clay under our feet to put it on our heads in some way? And how do we have a tool, to properly measure what is still invested into buildings that for 100 years won't be adapted to climate change and will be increasing what is currently happening? This is my first. I mean, it's a very simple thing. We are definitely, well, I know, maybe we're getting into that in the Paris Forum if we succeed in that, but I know, this is really an interrogation for me. Second question is, and this is a question for, are we able to have a mitigation potential report? Meaning, what is the mitigation potential of the building sector? How could we measure that? Could be quite simple to say we know more or less what's going to be built in the 10 in coming years in this country and this country, and if we go, so it would give rather than give this gap, we would be able to measure the gap, and to track progress regarding this target that. to have an evaluation of the mitigation potential. It shouldn't be that difficult to produce.
Yeah. Let me start with that second question. I mean, the IEA, for example, in its net zero emissions scenario, is in the end describing mitigation scenarios for all the economy, including the building sector, of course. And there are a range of studies which do that. So the region by region, what the globe.
Region by region or country by country, we are currently able to say we're going there exactly, and the surface that we're going to build is going to drive there.
Yeah. I think we do not have it currently for all the countries on this planet. But the Global ABC has launched a few years ago a road mapping exercise which is working with many countries on this planet to really define what the roadmap should look like. And that is like a mitigation scenario. In European legislation, member states have to develop so-called national renovation strategies. That's also some kind of a mitigation scenario. So I think we have a number of studies, a number of reports to tell us where the journey should go to, how quickly it should go, and what kind of technologies can really deliver the mitigation. But we have not done one which would cover with the same methodology, for example, all continents or all regions or all countries. The reason why we have chosen the gap approach is because we want to measure progress. We want to answer the question, is our progress on these indicators and in the index and in total fast enough? Because you can be quite good in one indicator, for example, the increase of green building certification can be quite good and quite steep, but if the other indicators do not develop in the same direction, in the same way, then we're not on the decarbonization pathway. To your question about the brown investments and whether investments should still go into real estate, which is not fully aligned with the Paris Agreement, probably it shouldn't. But it's a question to ask to the real estate investment community, to the asset managers who are all there. And if the global ABC, who will then publish the report at the beginning of March, wants to include that, of course, this is a sneak preview. This is not the final end, and I think there will be a number of discussions happening between the membership group of the global ABC, how to finalize that and how to fine-tune that. Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? If not, I think we have time for one still. Okay.
Yeah, I think it follows up on your question, Yves. The Global Building Forum is really exciting, bringing together national governments for the first time on a shared agenda, cooperating, looking at research, focusing. But just to follow that point, what advice could you give to non-party actors to support that initiative? What can the supply chain, the international supply chain in the built environment do? What should they bring to the Global Buildings Forum that would support that initiative?
I'm wondering whether we should give the answer, or we should ask Yves Laurent from the French government to answer that question. What should the private sector, the non-governments, bring to the forum? I have a few ideas, but we have you in the room.
Yeah, so, well, as you know, the forum is going to be organized in form of, well, the 7th of March is going to be a stakeholders day in some way to prepare answers or questions to engagement for the second day that would be more a ministerial meeting. So we have a whole setup of, we have workshops to prepare this moment. We have 20 sessions in preparation, all on on topics. One on private finance, the other one on development finance, the other one on the role of local authorities, some on tracking progress, some on what that new technologies can bring to the building sector, both in terms of resilience and in terms of mitigation. So there's many sessions, and these sessions are going to be prepared by mainly the persons, the interested person, and they will bring recommendations at the moment, recommendations and hopefully engagements also, because it's not only asking questions like asking the governments to do so, but also to be able to say we are going to do so. So basically what is going to be what we need from stakeholders is to say we can go that far, we can do this. Because at the end of the day, the building's value chain is a value chain that is not very self-conscious. So the motto of this forum would be how to solidify the value chain by solidifying each of its links and by solidifying mutual trust. And mutual trust can only be gained through engagement of individuals. So if development banks say, for example, we are going to stop any investment that goes into brown buildings, very good, we take that. This is the kind of engagement we would be looking for, and there can be lots. I mean, each link, each partner, each stakeholder of this value chain should be able to say what can I do? What can I bring to the table? This is probably what we're looking for. So we are preparing a declaration for the governments, but we need also the others to say what they can do for themselves. Not me to tell you what. That's what we're intending to do.
Thank you. Is there another question from the floor? If not, I think, Jonathan, we close the meeting.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Oliver, for giving us a preview. I think interesting discussion. A lot of challenges ahead of us still, but I think also, as Yves Laurent said, I think what we're expecting is really for the value chain people to come and say we're ready to work with you governments to actually make this happen. Because when I talk to a lot of I talk quite a bit lately with my colleagues from the UNEP Finance Initiative and the commercial banks, they're all very interested to look at how can they decarbonize their real estate portfolio, but then they're asking, okay, how do I know whether it's going to be a net zero building or a decarbonized building? And that's where maybe the certifications come in, but providing tools also actually to those actors that are not yet used to all these things is a very important element. So I think that there is an opportunity. The point you mentioned about the roadmaps, definitely a good point. But still, and you said it earlier, data is a challenge. So, even when we go into countries and we work with the countries on developing the roadmaps, in some cases, it's really difficult to kind of give a number in terms of mitigation potential, because they don't know, for example, their building stock. And if you don't know the building stock and you don't know how it's going to grow, then it's very difficult to come up with some kind of numbers. Because I think what Yves Laurent was mentioning also, it would be good to show numbers, because numbers speak to people. So I think there we still have a challenge also overall. But I mean, yeah, we're together and we continue fighting for this. So I hope we'll make it work.
That's what we're doing, and I think the global ABC has an enormously important role because it brings together the private sector, the civil society community, and the governments. And I think that's exactly the most important thing we can do: collaborate together. So thank you very much for coming.